Anyway, here we are. Here's the Abbey at last, and again, a warm welcome. This is the nave, obviously, if you know the parts of the church with nave there, chancel up here. The length of the nave is 75 metres. I think that works out at 243 feet in real money. And it is the largest nave of any church in the British Isles. It is just about the largest nave of any church in Europe. Why they built such a big church, nobody knows. That's one of the mysteries. It's all mysteries in this particular church. So what happened to it all? Obviously there appears to be a bit of a break here because we're standing in what would be the crossing. These walls would be the transept walls. They would square up and the chancel would go on down there. Now, how do we know what was going on? Well, we don't really. We're not sure. One of the mysteries of Abbeycwmhir is whether the church was ever completed. It was being built on an absolutely massive scale. So 75 metres on the nave. That would make it slightly bigger than Durham Cathedral. It would make it bigger than Winchester Cathedral as well, but just about the biggest. Quite a bit bigger than Westminster Abbey. In the middle of nowhere? What was going on here? Who built it? Was it one of the Welsh princes? Did they have the finance? Did they have the clout to get the materials? The more likely solution is that it was probably the Mortimers who were building it, the Mortimer Lordship, people who were supposed to be keeping things in order in this part of the world and on behalf of the King, Henry III. So we don't really know for sure whether it was completed. A good observer of the scene around 1840, which is just about the time of the dissolution, was a chap called John Leland. And Leland embarked on a journey around England and Wales looking at buildings, and he was interested in building because that was his job. He was the chief building advisor to Henry VIII, and by and large his reports are known to be very accurate. A lot of people writing at that time would have said what the king wanted to hear, because that would have been a lot safer. But anyway, Leland came around 1840, 1839, looked at the nave and recorded it as a huge and sumptuous building. Right, so we know that was all complete, all up and running, just about the time of the dissolution. But he then goes on to say that he was a little bit mystified because the chancel appeared to have not been completed. He could find the footings, the foundations, and the walls were raised up so high, but did not appear to have been built in its entirety. So it is quite possible that the church was never completed. It's a slightly unusual situation. It wouldn't be unique in being the only Abbey church, monastic church, not to be completed. Some of you may know Tally Abbey, which is near Llandailo, Tarallachai, and that is not complete because the benefactor of the abbey fell out with Edward I, lost his castle at Dynefor and all his wealth, and so the church was never completed. But they did build the east end, because that was the area with the altars and where all the worship took place and the sacraments were carried out. That was important. That's the bit they built first. So you've got an east end at Tally, but not a west end. Only some stumps of the pillars that they started but never finished. If you go to Anthony Priory, which was completed, and look at the styles of architecture, you'll find the east end is what we call Romanesque. It's basically a Norman sort of style, round pillars, round arches. But as you go further up the church west, it's the early English style. So they started with the east end and then built that. So quite why these monks or their benefactors built the church back to front and then abandoned it, we don't know. We're not even sure what happened. We've really only got Leland's report on what was going on here. You could work it out, because these sorts of churches, Cistercian churches, were often built on a proportion of 3 to 1. And that works very well. As I took some time when I had, of course, absolutely nothing else to do but come down here with my tape measure and measure everything. It's 75 metres that way, it's 25 metres that way. So it's a proportion 3 to 1. If you take the walls of the transept, it's a third of the opening here. So from that you could work out where the rest of the church went, and it would stop just about on the fence line. So absolutely enormous, and then an ambulatory around it. And the what we call the claustral buildings, which is where the monks lived and worked, were always on the south side. So the cloister would have been here, with not with the electric supply in the middle of it, but in that area there. The chapter house, we think, was probably just beyond here, and the dormitory and refectory over there, further towards where they're running out towards the tree there. So it is possible to conjecture, and we've got some parchmark photographs from 2018, some aerials, which appear to show things going on there. They do also appear to show things going on here, but even if they only built the foundations and started the walls, that would still show on the parchmark. But 25 years ago, CPAT did a geophysical survey on this area, and it was very inconclusive, so it didn't show, but it often doesn't. A couple of years ago I was down at Shaftesbury, and the Abbey there doesn't have an east end, but it's because, like here, the stone in the area is so awful for building. An abbey is a very good source of good building stone, and there the stone had been grubbed out right down into the ground, and even at foundation level there was nothing left. So it's quite possible that stone has been taken from this end, but we find no trace. What we could do, although I think it's probably not worth it, is do some sample trenches across at certain points. And you have to be very clever to do this. You have to look at the lithography of the soil that you're pulling out, and different grain size and all that. It gets quite technical, and you could possibly see where lines of excavation had been to make foundations. That said, a lot of Cistercian churches were built on very, very poor foundations. And some work was done by a chap called Larn way back in the 1950s, and then redone much more recently, which suggested that for many Cistercian churches, the foundations were only about 15 centimetres deep. It was extraordinary. They trigged out a ditch about that sort of depth where they wanted to build. They laid pebbles in the bottom of that, put a bit of gravel on top of that, smoothed that, and then started to build up the stones on top of that. So it was just the sheer weight of the church and the interlocked stones that was holding everything up together, and probably goes quite a long way to explain why Abbey churches, and indeed other churches of that period, fell down with such enthusiasm, because collapses of churches buildings were common. The great Norman tower at Ely Cathedral, which was an abbey in those days, collapsed in 1322. Tons of masonry crashing down. So falls were possible. So it's possible that some catastrophic fall had taken place at this end of the church, although there's no written record of that. So it's really a matter of speculation as to what was going on. Anyway, the building itself was done by teams of itinerant workers. The masons were incredibly clever people, as I said just now. and very accurate in their laying out of the site. And the master mason was responsible for all the laying out on the site work. And they would start with the south wall, which was the one on that side in this context, and lay it out very accurately. The ideal was to get it on an east-west axis. This one is actually in common with a number of other Cistercian churches in Wales, slightly off-key of that. This one is not quite east-west, and that may well be due to the limitations of the site. Tintern Abbey is north-south because of the narrow shelf alongside the River Wye that it's built on. So this one is about, I think, 9 degrees out, but it has certain symbolic results. The idea of the east-west axis was that the sun shines in the east window on the Midsummer's Day. So there again you have a link with what actually is a pagan. What are they doing down at Stonehenge but waiting for the sun to rise over the east end? Being offset slightly, as this one is, you find that the sun shines directly in the west window or the west door on the autumn solstice, so equinox rather. So how deliberate was that? And that is the case in quite a number of Cistercian churches in Wales. Somebody asked me where the monks came from. Just now, the answer for everybody's benefit. Abbeycwmhir was founded by the monks of Whitland. Whitland had been founded by monks coming from Cîteaux in France in 1143, and then it was the job of the monks to get their religious house up and running, basically, and then send a detachment of people off somewhere else to start another monastery. It's also the sort of equivalent of the modern idea of church planting. So you get one going, then once that was up and running, send some people off to start another. And they were known as daughter houses. So this was a daughter house of Whitland, which was really the sort of master centre for all of the mid-Wales monastic setups, like Strata Florida would include in that. The daughter house of Cwmhir was at Cummer, at Abbeycwmhir, founded just short of 1200. And they moved from place to place. So they had quite a network of monasteries, and they were not all that far apart. We tend to get the idea that the Cistercians always lived in isolation. In fact, they were on quite a good routeway here, and the abbeys were really only 25-30 miles apart. So if you started somewhere like Margam or Neath, you get to Whitland, you get to Strata Florida, you get here, you go to Strata Marcella, you go to Valley Crucis, and finish up at Basingwork. You have a whole network of line of Cistercian houses, mostly only 25-30 miles apart. So it was not perhaps quite so important to be in an isolated position. That might be the idea of St Bernard, who founded the movement, but it didn't actually work out. It was suggested that the abbey here was founded in 1143, but that I think would have been impossible because 1143 was the foundation of Whitland, so they couldn't be founding two abbeys at the same time. And I would include in the Whitland family, as it were, Dore Abbey, which I visited the other day, because although that was founded by monks from Moramont in France, it effectively was managed by Whitland, the important monastery of the area. If you look at the stones, you may find a mason's mark here and there. Each mason had his own mark. It was a matter of pride that he put his mark on the work that he'd done, but it was also probably a method of paying him, because he was paid by the stone, and so he put his mark on. They were like batch marks, really. And all the workers worked in teams. Of great importance was the carpenters as well, and their responsibility was to erect this incredible scaffolding that was put up. No sending for SGB or Brecon scaffolding or whatever. It was all made on site from wood and had to be very secure to carry the weight and the safety angle. In some of the walls you can still see putlog holes where the horizontals were trapped into the stonework as you went, and then when things were finished they were either cut off, or if they could be pulled out then a stone was put in to seal that up. There was a door here, probably coming in from the cloister, another one further down that end, which was probably the monks' night entrance to come from the dormitories, which would be in that area beyond there, and come down to this interminable round of services every day, and they didn't get much sleep at all. Here we have the commemoration of Llewellyn ap Griffith, who died at Cilneri at the hands of, we're not quite sure who really, but there was this strange battle that took place at Orland Bridge down there, 1288. Quite what was going on we don't really know. Some suggest that faced with the possibility of getting a peace deal with the English, that drew Llewellyn there. We don't really know. Why they had a battle on the 12th or 11th of December is a mystery, because it was way outside what we call the fighting season. There was a certain set season for battles in medieval times because of the daylight. Battles were a long drawn out affair, and of course the weather as well. So what was going on is just another mystery. But it is thought that Llewellyn's body was brought to Cwmhir for burial. The Cistercians in Wales were very sympathetic to the cause of the Welsh princes, and so that makes sense. It was certainly one report that said Llewellyn had white monks with him, white priests, at the time of the battle as well. So it's quite reasonable that he was brought back here. And there's two letters, at least, quite angry letters from the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, who was John Peckham, to the Archdeacon of Brecon, demanding to know why he had allowed Llewellyn to be buried at Cwmhir, where he could be the focus of further insurrection and trouble. We don't have the answers to these questions, but there are those who say no, he most certainly wouldn't have been buried here. And they suggest that he was taken perhaps to Llantarnam, which is, well, roughly in the suburb of Cardiff these days, or maybe even to Bristol, much further afield, where he would not be a focus for further problems. Again, we don't know. What we do know from documentary evidence, the gory nature of the times, that his head was lopped off and taken up to Rhuthlan, where Edward I was billeted with his forces, just to prove that they had actually killed him. I'm sure there were other ways of doing it. And in common with the other traitors of the time, it's pretty awful times really, it spent some years on a spike outside the Tower of London. So, that was the way of those days anyway. And just a couple of other things while we're here, just keeping an eye on the time. On that side of the Abbey buildings, nothing to do with the Abbey, is a mound or a mount. Again, made by Thomas Wilson, so obviously no end of monastic artifacts buried in there as well. And that was part of a landscaping, almost certainly part of a landscaping effort to improve his garden. So I say he wanted all this as part of his garden. He built up the land a bit up there as well, as we were saying. He created the pond lake down here, which was stocked with fish, but I think the lack of water has put the kibosh on that. And what wasn't put the kibosh on by the weather has been done by the local otters. We have got otters here, so a little bit of natural history for you. And far too many mink, I'm afraid. They're a damn nuisance. And polecats as well. But going back to the mound, I said that it's what was known as a prospect mound, and it was much more a feature of big 18th century gardens than 19th century when this was being laid out. But you brought your guests down through for a saunter from the house, down through the ruin and up onto the mound, which is probably sort of naturally lowered a bit over the years, and then you could view your parkland. But if you want to know what the arcading really looked like, go to the church of Llynedloes, because in 1540 they were doing some work and rebuilding the church over there. So they purchased 5 bays from the crown, because the whole object of one of the main objects of the exercise was to raise money for Henry VIII. And so they built 5 bays and they re-erected them. They didn't use the full height of the pillars, but they've used the capitals and the basic pillar. And fantastic. We got some models of them in the exhibition room, actually. About to come to the end, there's a couple of things. I think I mentioned on passing earlier on that we were interested in this house and the cellar. The cellar is through the door underneath. And what is very strikingly obvious is the cellar is a complete misfit to the house, which makes us think that the cellar may well be from a medieval building that stood on this site before. And this would be the obvious place for the gatehouse. And so we're doing some investigations on that. We've got an expert coming to look at the stonework in there later in the month. And we gather that the garden is underpinned by a lot of stones. When you dig in the garden, there's lots of stones there. And we think that this was part of the gatehouse. The gatehouse would have been there. Another building parallel to it, so you had an arch between, and this would have been the entrance. It's all conjecture at the moment. Everything's conjecture with this, but that would make complete sense. And the almonry would have been there, where one of the functions of the monastery was to feed the local people who were in difficulty, or travellers and so on. Just to prove that recycling is nothing new. One of you spotted these pieces up there. I'm not sure how long they've been there, but so we had this painting, found this painting that's in the National Library, done just at the turn of the 18th century, 18th, 19th century, and the house looks very much as it does today. So although there's a date round the other side, which is I think 1806, no, it's earlier, because the artist was a Scotsman who'd emigrated to Canada, but came back for a painting tour between 1797 and 1799. So we have a fairly precise date as to when he painted this picture, which includes the ruin and included the house. I'm not sure if you couldn't see those pieces up there, and we think they look like part of the top of a pillar, but we think in fact they were probably little parts of a niche to put a statue on, and they were quite commonly found on gatehouses, which also adds to our little bit of building up the evidence that the gatehouse was here. Anyway, beyond there, when you get out into the yard, jumping centuries to about 1850, we've got what's known as the home farm. It used to be the Abbey farm, going back historically, but this is a rebuild around 1850, and it is the model farm was the model farm for the estate. The influences for agriculture in Wales at that time were coming across the border, because land was being bought by people from across the border, and they would bring their ideas with them. And so it's an absolutely fantastic set of buildings, a real classic of its time, and listed. Wants a little bit of repair here and there, but looks good. And in one of the buildings on the left, the exhibition room, you will see a life-size model of one of the capitals. If you want to have a look at it. The design is called Stiff Leaf. I'm not quite sure why. As I was saying to some of you who are near me down there are 5 columns from the in Llanidloes Church, because they bought them at the dissolution because they wanted to expand and do up the church at Llanidloes. And they're just absolutely fabulous. But the style evolves, and they were individual craftsmen. So although there are 5 capitals that you can see at Llanidloes, no 2 are exactly the same. Just good. Unlike today's mechanisation, where everyone would be machined and actually identical. So you get that individuals. The stone that the walls were built was relatively local. There was an outcrop of decent stone at the top of the hill behind here, at a place which is we call Fowler's Cave. It's not a cave, it's a quarry. And also some of the stone quarries just south of Rhoda have this sort of stone in, but most of the local stone is shaly and goes to pieces. The decorative stone, with the carved stuff like the capitals and so on, is a type of sandstone, which was widely thought to have come from Grinshill, just north of Shrewsbury there. But we're now doubting that, because the stone that we have here has got mica in it, and the Grinshill stone does not have mica in it. And it depends on how it was deposited. It comes from the sort of Permo-Triassic period. And one in the Permian, the deposition was underwater, and the Triassic it was not. And the difference is in the one you get mica and the other you don't. And Grinshill doesn't fit the bill. But it's the sandstones that you get on, say, the Epping, down beyond between Bilth and Leithwen, Brecon, would be the correct ones, and also some near Ludlow. So they actually transported stone over huge distances if the need was there. The idea that everything was locally sourced just is not so. To such an extent, I came across some of the stone in South Florida comes from a quarry at a place called Dundry, which is just south of Bristol. And that Dundry stone also occurs in a monastic building in Ireland. So distance was no object, basically. And if you look at some of the churches and abbeys of southern England, they're built of Carn stone, which has come across the other side of the channel. So they were quite happy to move materials vast. In this locality, it all points to somebody like the Mortimers, who had the clout to get that organised, because you would need right safe passage if you were lumbering thousands of tons of stone by cart, ox-drawn cart, over whether it's 50, 60 miles from Shrewsbury, 40 miles from the Epping, or whatever. You're very vulnerable, so you need good passage. And I think probably the Mortimers were the only people who had the political clout to be able to get safe passage. So I may be wrong, but we're often wrong.